When it comes to making games, one of the biggest tasks is designing the world that it takes place in. It's easy to say you're going to have a fantasy world with dragons and magic, but the hard part comes when you have to answer the question, what does this world look like? You start to realise that there are loads of little details you have to think about that you've never thought about before. Things like, how wide are the roads? What do the mountains look like? Will the buildings be made out of wood or stone? What kind of trees do I want? As the questions start to pile up, it's easy to become overwhelmed, and giving up starts to feel like the only option. In this video, I'm going to go through how I've been approaching this problem for my game, Dreadwinter. Before I get into the video, I've set up a Discord server that's looking a bit empty at the moment. I'd like to post regular updates about what I'm working on, but I'd rather not be an old man yelling at a cloud, so consider joining. Recently, I've been working on completing Lunara, the main town in my game. The concept I have for it is that it's a popular tourist destination that's located on the way to the royal capital of Lindengard, the fictional country the game takes place in. With that in mind, it needs to have unique buildings and attractions that people would come to see, which form the basis of how I designed the town. Some examples of this are Gelato & Co., which is a famous ice cream store, a health clinic that's built into a giant tree, the observatory at the highest point in town, as well as a view overlooking the rest of the country. If you played the demo, you might notice that not all of these are accessible at the moment, since I wasn't completely sure about what I wanted it to look like, and didn't really have the time to think about it. Now that I've got some time, I've started to work on making playable areas for these places. This takes us back to what I said at the start of the video about the challenge of level design. As an example, it's easy for me to say I want to create a restaurant that's also a bathhouse, but I find myself staring at a blank canvas and wondering what that would actually look like. When I start designing, I generally have a single concept or idea in mind as a prompt. Let's say if I were designing a dungeon, it might be something like an island surrounded by lava or a winding maze. It just needs to be something that I can visualize and build around. I knew I wanted it to be Asian inspired, and the idea of a dim sum restaurant came up. Dim sum is a Chinese meal that consists of a range of small dishes and is usually eaten during brunch hours, so late morning to early afternoon. It's something that I've been eating for most of my life, and I've been to a fair few dim sum restaurants, so I had a pretty good image of the aesthetic I wanted to go for. The first thing I do is to design a floor plan. This can be a bit tricky if you're starting from scratch, since there isn't anything to base it off. In this case, I designed the building a while ago, so I can roughly follow the shape of it. A lot of the restaurants I've been to are quite large, or at least give the impression that they are, so the original design was also quite large. I also wanted a cozy vibe, but I think large and cozy are concepts that tend to clash, so I cut the area down by a bit. This also meant that I had less to design, which was a bonus. Next was figuring out the colour palette and flooring. Since the building was already done, I can reuse some of the colours. Red is the central colour, being a lucky colour in Chinese culture, and I think blue pairs well with it. I'm a fan of wood flooring, and specifically dark wood, so I use it whenever I can. It adds a lot of texture and is easy to draw. You generally want the colour of the floor and the wall to contrast, which means that I'm looking to use lighter colours for the walls. One thing I used to worry about was adding texture to the walls, and whether everything needed to be detailed. But really, I don't think it matters as long as you have something that draws the eye. Something I recommend doing is playing similar games and seeing how they approach things to either get new ideas or validate your own. I've been playing Sunhaven recently, and one thing I've noticed is that the game has a mixture of very detailed assets as well as plain ones, but you don't really notice the plain stuff. As long as you have something that the viewer will focus on, you don't need everything else to have the same level of detail, which means that they don't fight for attention. That being said, I do like to have a bit of detail on my walls, so I use the gradient tool with dithering to make it a bit more interesting. Having a solid concept makes coming up with ideas for decorations easier. For example, most of a restaurant will consist of the seating area, so you can fill most of it with tables and chairs. A lot of restaurants use large tablecloths that drape over the edge, so I tried to recreate that. There's a small bar area in front of the kitchen, and I remember seeing a porthole looking into the kitchen in one restaurant, which I thought was pretty cool, so I decided to add one as well. It's not really important to talk about, but remembering little details like that makes designing easier. When designing places, I think it's a good idea to imagine what you can do there and what sort of things happen on a day-to-day basis, even if it's not playable, as it can give you more ideas and helps add character. If we're talking about this restaurant, I did wonder for a while what you'd actually be able to do there. A lot of the time, restaurants in games aren't really interactive, essentially being another shop and maybe having one-time events. Focusing on the idea of dim sum, I think it would be cool to have dishes you could order, where each dish gives a small stat boost, such as increased movement speed, damage, or an income boost, and the boosts last for a certain amount of time, maybe just enough for a cafe shift, so it'd be a routine to visit each day. I also added a stage for karaoke. At first it was just for decoration, but I had the idea of there being a karaoke night each week. It would have no gameplay benefits, but it would be something extra to do. I'm not sure what the actual implementation would be like, but thinking about things like that gives me the motivation to keep working. Continuing on, I then moved on to the second half of the diner/bathhouse, the bath. I had a bunch of ideas in mind, like I wanted it to be an indoor bath, but I also wanted there to be a lot of plants and trees, which is something you'd see outdoors, and I wasn't sure how to design an indoor garden bath. There was also the idea of there being a giant window that allowed you to see outside. The main hurdle to overcome was cutting everything down to one coherent idea. In the end, I went for an outdoors Japanese style stone bath, which fit the image I had in mind, and had a lot of references available. While I now had the concept of what I wanted to make, I didn't really have a good idea of how to make it. There were extra things to consider, such as how to present it as an outdoor area, since I wanted to give the impression of the bath being outside without using a background, as I felt like there was too much contrast between the style of the bath and the aesthetic of Lunara. It took a few days before I found something I was happy with, but I think it looks good. To complete the scene and add a bit of life to it, I finished off by adding some moving parts. I don't think there needs to be too much, as I want it to add to the scene rather than taking over and drawing attention from everything else. The easiest way to do this is to add running water to the water features in the diner, and I had the idea of there being lanterns floating around, which would also be lit up during the night. I have a shader that I used in the concept level to create a fog effect, and modified some of the settings to create a steam effect for the bath. I think it really completes the cozy nature of the bath. I'm not completely set on what benefits the bath will have in-game. In Stardew Valley, it serves as a way to regain energy for free, but given that there isn't an energy system in Dreadwinter, the alternative would be to regain health and mana. My main concern is that since exploration is mostly dungeon based and you'd be travelling around a lot, it would be a bit of a distance to travel just to refuel, so I guess you'd really be going for the vibes, which is enough of a reason anyway. As well as the diner, I also designed the observatory, which is one of the main tourist destinations in town. I don't want this video to be too long, so I'll save that part for the next one. My approach to it is mostly the same as before, but there's a few extra things I want to talk about. I also did some more character design, which also tied into how I designed some parts, but I want to make a separate video on that as well. As for what I'm doing next, there's still some more areas to design, such as the manor of Mayor Moon, as well as the homes of some of the other characters. I like to shift between art and programming to avoid burnout, so I might start working on more of the gameplay before that. I'm at a point where there's a lot to do, but there isn't a particular order I need to do anything in, so it's mostly a matter of what I feel like. I'm also trying to spend a bit more time on marketing my game, such as revamping the store art and being more active on social media. That's about it for this video. I'd like to work on making more frequent, shorter videos, so hopefully the next one comes soon. Like, subscribe and wishlist Dreadwinter if you haven't, and thanks for watching.